Someone reached out to me on Instagram asking if I would share some of the photo books that inspire me, and I thought this was a nice opportunity to talk not only about the photo books, but just generally books that inspire me. First, we have Dorothea Lange, Words and Pictures. This is such a cool and unique book. I love it as much for the imagery as I do for the layout. The layout here is really considered and really, I don't know, it's just got a very textural feel, and I love all the handwritten notes and diary entries. I'm a huge Dorothea Lange fan. One of the books that's actually not here, but which I would absolutely recommend, is Dorothea Lange's biography, A Life Beyond Limits. She is one of the most heroic and inspiring characters and really embodies so much of what I love about photography as a medium, a means of activism, human connection, storytelling, and meaningful difference in the world. This is an absolute classic, The Photographer's Eye. If you've ever studied photography or know anything about sort of seminal photographers before or up until, say, like Eggleston, William Eggleston obviously being kind of one of the pioneers of color photography, this book covers everything, and Eggleston wouldn't be who he is without this curator from the MoMA, who really pioneered and shepherded the vision of these very sort of revolutionary photographers of their day. This is just a wonderful walk through the history of photography and highly recommended. Instant, The Story of Polaroid. This book is just such a phenomenal account of the rise of Polaroid, the genius of Edward Land, who created this company from nothing. And if you haven't or don't know anything about him, I'm going to link below another YouTube video that I really enjoyed that sort of goes into his history. But wow, what an incredible man. You know, problematic in many ways, but really amazing what he accomplished in his lifetime. The Americans, I mean, I don't know if any list can go without it. And really what I think is so great about this book and Robert Frank's take on America is the way he sequenced the images. I look at it for the narrative and the sequencing even as much or more than the images themselves. American Color 2 by Konstantin Manos is just a study of graphic composition, layering, and color. I just love looking at this book. It is so dynamic. It has a lot of flavors that might be familiar. I think everyone's probably a bit more aware of Alex Webb. There's definitely a ton of similarity in their style and their execution, but this is just a great book. If you're into Alex Webb, I feel pretty certain you're going to want this book as well. Exiles by Joseph Kudelka. This is an interesting book. I really think Kudelka is one of those really fascinating photographers. He worked within a very limited range of things. He shot his entire Gypsies series, I believe, with a 25mm or 28mm lens on really pushed, I can't remember if it was Tri-X 400, but he shoots exclusively in black and white. His work is really, there's something very real and very immediate about it. Arthur L. Gort's Models Manuals. Okay, this is not a book you probably would see on most people's inspiration list. He was a fashion photographer, is a fashion photographer, and my mom worked with him a lot. He always carried a camera with him, and my mom always laughs that I remind her of Arthur because I'm never without my camera. I don't think a lot of people are that are into photography these days, but back then that was a much different thing. Like, he was always bringing film and different cameras, and he shot with so many different cameras. He was not beholden to one format or one brand. He just loved photography. Cape Light by Joel Meyerowitz. This is just a classic. I think this was actually Joel's first book. I think he is such an inspiration just as a photographer, but also as a speaker, as someone who loves color. This is just a study of light and just various complementary colors. There's a lot of monochromatic kind of color schemes here. It's just a beautiful body of work. And if you are not familiar with Joel Meyerowitz, which I imagine you are, but if you're not, look him up on YouTube. He's just an inspiration in and of himself. So this is a very different book. This is called Lou's Summer. It's actually by a friend of mine, Chantel, who is a photojournalist who's lived in the Bronx in New York for like 12 years. And she, during the pandemic, when it got really hot in New York and everything shut down, she went back to the Netherlands with her family and started to photograph this summer with her son in this very like changed world, and gave him a camera as well, and they shared this camera, and this book is a collaborative sort of output of that time together. And there's just something really beautiful in that project. For me as a mother, it meant a lot. Like, I'm getting emotional just talking about it, but they really worked on this as a project to kind of focus and ground and offer sort of a therapeutic output for this very difficult time for families and for the world. And I think they just did such a beautiful job in laying this out. I mean, it feels very personal. This book is available online. I am going to link it down below. I really think the images are beautiful, the layouts are beautiful, and it's also just a real marker of time, I think, for a very unique thing that we've all gone through in an unprecedented 100-year period. Okay, Bruce Davidson is one of my favorite all-time photographers. I just love how and what he photographed, and he was so prolific. If you don't know him, look him up. He just sees the world as a theater, and I do too, and I think there's humanity in his photos, but there's also this sort of cinematography eye, and he really sees the world in his own way. But his work is fantastic, so I love this set of books. Sebastião Salgado is one of those photographers. Oh gosh, there's another book I haven't mentioned, Witness in Our Time. I'll put the link in the show notes below, but that's where I learned about Sebastião Salgado. I became really obsessed with him and his early work. And what's so interesting about him, he was a photojournalist documenting these just horrors, these massacres and genocides, and he burned out, and he just stopped photographing. He said he couldn't photograph anymore. And it wasn't until this book, or this collection of work, that he was inspired to re-engage, and it's called Genesis, and it's all about finding the inspiration again around photography. His work is just so signature Salgado and really worth diving into. Martin Munkascsi, I think is how you say his name. But this is also a slightly lesser known photographer, again, older photographer, but was capturing motion and movement at a time when that was very challenging from a photographic standpoint. He was really a pioneer, and Richard Avedon has actually cited him as kind of his inspiration when he was young and a photographer. He would be able to capture these things that just no one else was doing, where there was just movement and freedom in the photography, and there's character and humor, and he's just a very unique point of view, especially for his time. So Stephen Height is a fashion photographer that, again, not a lot of people seem to know about. He's very much in the vein of like a Helmut Newton, or someone with these very sort of striking, more, I don't know, again, I think of these things as like textural, but like more angular photography, more hard photography, if I were to give it a texture. But I really think his images are unique and interesting. He was starting to incorporate strobe. My mom worked with him a lot. I should mention, my mom was a model, and she worked with him a lot, and she turned me on to his books and his imagery, and I was like, wow, how have I not heard about this guy? I really think his work is great, and so I look at this because I feel like it's just a little different, and it shakes the status quo a little bit, and I really like it. I am also just generally very obsessed with the history of photography, from, the early daguerreotypes to the tintype photography and all the different formulations and means of technological progress that have happened along the way. So this is just a wonderful book to sort of look at. It's a bit of a timeline of important photography through the ages. This was put together by the Smithsonian. I could nerd out on this all day. Even if it's not an image that I think is incredible as an image alone, the way that it fits into the significance of history really gets me excited. Irving Penn. So this is from the Centennial show that the MoMA put on. I think it was the MoMA. And I actually went to this show in New York, and it was just wonderful, a real collection of all of his work throughout time. Penn did everything from fashion to still life to, historical documentation. I mean, he didn't do photojournalism. Everything was in a studio. My mom, again, shot with him a lot. I just love this approach, and I particularly love his still lifes. He's really known mostly, I would say, for his fashion work, but his still lifes are really striking. Mary Ellen Mark, oh my gosh, she's one of those women who, as a female photographer, creative, I am so struck by her and everything that she has documented. She is just a fierce, incredible woman who has really put herself in so many people's shoes to be able to capture their experience, their world, and I have so much admiration for her, and her work stands and speaks for itself. Paul Strand, I mean, if you want to study black and white, he just has so much tonality in his negatives and prints, and I find him fascinating. I'm also personally really obsessed with New Mexico and the life that he has lived and the circles he traveled in, Stieglitz and O'Keeffe and all these other people in that time. So I as much love his photography as I do the story around it. The New York Times Photographs book, this was curated or put together by Kathy Ryan, who is the photo director at the magazine at New York Times. And she is the one who kind of honestly shepherds a lot of modern photographers. Being in the New York Times magazine as a photographer is a very, very big deal and can really start a career. And this is a compilation of images she selected as being marked photographs in a modern context. And for that reason alone, I love to look at this just to study okay, what's interesting about this image, or why did she choose this, or, just understand one of truly today's most important photo editors. And so, yeah, it's a great, great collection, particularly from a bit more of a contemporary lens. Obviously, a lot of the people I've discussed here are older references. All right, we're moving into non-photography books now. Neutra is an architect whose work is just phenomenal. If you're into mid-century modern, you know all about Neutra. And having moved to California 5 years ago, I got really interested in some of his work. LA and California and the West Coast in general is kind of a real sort of breeding ground for this modern architecture, and I actually recently went to visit his house in Silver Lake, and I just love studying both the philosophy and the execution and the visual sort of stimuli of these houses that he architected. They're just stunning works of art, in my opinion. Sticking with that theme of mid-century modern, Sea Ranch is actually above San Francisco by a few hours. It is a town on the coast, and it's somewhere that my family and we go usually every summer, and it was a particular refuge from COVID for us, the way that the Netherlands was for my friend Chantel. And this is just a magical utopia. I mean, I think it's probably game over at this point because it's been covered a ton in the news recently. But, well, while we've been there, it was really kind of under the radar, and the architecture is stunning, the nature is stunning, and I look to this book just to give myself all those great vibes. You are an artist. So I love this book, both from the exercises themselves, but also just the philosophy of it. These are like snackable projects that you can do to get yourself out of a rut. It's kind of a challenge. It's way outside of the field of photography. There are photographic assignments in here, but this is much more broad. This is really to get yourself detached from what you think is dumb or silly and really get you to think more abstractly or try things that just feel weird. And I love that. I so embrace getting out of the norm and just thinking about things a little differently. I think this is the greatest lubricant for creative juices to flow. In a similar vein, there is the classic The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron. This book has been around for a hot second, and this is, again, just a very accessible way to commit to a daily practice of creative engagement. And it's wonderful, it's proven, it's tried and true, and I totally recommend it. Legacy, a step-by-step guide to writing personal history. You do not have to want to write your own personal history or someone else's. I just think this book is a fantastic way to engage with the world around you and get curious about the people in your life. I have just used this as a refresh or prompt initiator for questions to ask. I mean, photography is as much a curiosity act as it is a means of documenting light and people and stories, and I think this is a great way to just, again, reconnect with the questions that make us want to photograph. Short Nights of the Shadow Catcher has to be one of the best books I have ever read. I have read this book so many times. It is the biography of Edward Curtis, who is a controversial figure in modern context for having photographed sort of the Native American populations before they were essentially exterminated horrifically by the US government. It's a very, very compelling story. Sad, tragic, incredible, fiercely determined figure, and just an absolute can't put down. So there you have it. Those are the books that I dip into when I need a little boost. Hopefully there was something new and exciting for you in there, and I will see you in the next video.